Alright, boys and girls, it's time for another episode of What the Dutch Doin'. Between that big tulip bubble and throwing hands with the ocean, the Dutch managed to forget about a war. This war was so chill that both sides probably spent more time picking daisies than planning attacks. Well, fasten your seatbelts, or better yet, don't, because we're diving into the 335 Years' War. A conflict that was more a marathon of mutual indifference than a sprint of skirmishes. In the annals of history, where tales of bloodshed and heroism abound, and where Italians fought over even a bucket, this war stands out for being, well, outstandingly insignificant. Picture this. It's the 17th century and Europe is a hot mess of wars, with countries duking it out for power, land, or just because someone looked at them funny. In this era of turmoil, the Isles of Scilly, a quaint archipelago off the southwest coast of England, and the mighty Dutch Republic became the unlikely protagonists in our tale of tepid tension. So, what got these two going? It all started with the English Civil War. In a series of 2 or 3, depending on who you ask, conflicts that plagued England from 1642 to 1651, the Isles of Scilly came onto the stage in a surprising way. Oliver Cromwell of the Parliamentarians was handing the Royalists their behinds as he pushed them back to the edge of Cornwall. With nowhere left to go and their backs to the sea in 1648, they fled to the Isles of Scilly, which became their last stronghold. Now enter the Dutch. Tensions were on the rise between the Republic of the Seven United Netherlands, with their slightly different from modern-day Netherlands flag, and England, over the overseas trading industry. And as they passed by the island, the parliamentarian allied Dutch found their ships under fire from royalist ships docked at these very isles. In a fit of what was probably just mild annoyance, the Dutch declared war on the Isles of Scilly in 1651, ostensibly to stop these attacks. After the surrender of the royalists later in the same year, the peace treaty signed made no mention of the state of war between the Dutch and the Isles. The year after, the first of 4 Anglo-Dutch wars began, which took both countries' attention from various points from the span of 1652 to 1784. The Dutch declaration of war on the Isles was less about vengeance and more about making a point, like telling your neighbor to keep their dog from doing its business on your lawn. Only in this case, the neighbor forgot they had a dog, and the lawn was just a tiny patch of grass that nobody really cared about. So there we have it. The stage is set for a conflict that sounds more like a forgotten chess game, where both players walked away to check if they left the stove on and never came back to the board. In what might be the most anticlimactic plot twist in military history, after the declaration, there were exactly 0 battles fought. No shots fired, no swords drawn, and no duels at dawn. It was as if both sides decided to wage war by seeing who could ignore the other the hardest. Imagine declaring war and then both parties just forget about it. The Isles of Scilly, who had been abandoned by the Royalists after their defeat in 1651, were too small and remote to pose a real threat to anyone. The Dutch also had bigger fish to fry, or in their case, more spices to trade and the newly formed Commonwealth of England to fight. The whole affair was so low-key that it wouldn't be surprising if there wasn't a single war meeting the entire time. If you thought this first act of war was a sleeper hit, then brace yourself for the extended intermission. The 335 Years' War entered what we might call its hibernation phase, where both sides took ignore it until it goes away to historical extremes. The Isles of Scilly, likely preoccupied with their scenic views, local agriculture, and lack of an independent government, continued life as usual. I mean, it's hard to maintain a warlike stance when you're surrounded by picturesque landscapes and probably more seagulls than people. And no navy or military of their own. That part's important too. Meanwhile, the Dutch Republic, which morphed into a series of other political entities over the centuries, was busy being a European powerhouse, leading trade, science, and art. They had about as much interest in reigniting this conflict as I did in the Isles of Scilly until I found out about this war. Years turned into decades, decades into centuries, and the war became akin to that one gym membership you forgot to cancel. It's still technically there, but nobody's really using it. The world changed, empires rose and fell, the Dutch renamed themselves 5, 10, or 20 times, I don't know, but the war, it just sort of didn't. It's a unique case of diplomatic amnesia, where both sides probably only remembered the war when flipping through old documents and mistaking it for a historical reenactment plan that never got off the ground. Oh right, we're still at war with Scilly. Weird. As we enter the final stretch of our epic tale, the year is 1986, and the world is bustling with technological advances, political dramas, and pop culture explosions. Meanwhile, the 335 Years' War is still technically on the books, snoozing away in a dusty corner of history until a historian named Roy Duncan decides it's high time this old conflict got a proper send-off. Roy, presumably while researching a chapter for a book titled Wars You've Never Heard of because literally nothing happened, stumbles upon this centuries-old oversight and probably thinks, wait, what? This can't be right. He contacts officials in the Isles of Scilly and the Netherlands, likely leading to the most awkward phone call in diplomatic history. So, we're still technically at war, right? The Dutch, ever practical, decided it was perhaps a good idea to officially call it quits, if only to clear up their historical paperwork. On April 17th, 1986, the Dutch ambassador to the United Kingdom visited the Isles of Scilly, where they signed a peace treaty with the utmost solemnity over what was probably the least solemn war in history. The event was less a grand diplomatic ceremony and more like turning off a light switch that had been accidentally left on for 335 years. In the end, the 335 Years' War stands out not for its strife or heroics, but it's for its monumental lack of either. It's a perfect example of what happens when bureaucracy meets forgetfulness and they decide to go on a long, uneventful vacation together. This war, with its lack of anything resembling actual war, reminds us that sometimes history is not just about the noise and the fury, but also about the quiet moments of collective oops that make us question, what were we thinking? So there you have it, the story of one of the longest and most peaceful wars in history. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.